Okay, so translucent materials is what we're going to be focusing on. Like I mentioned, we'll start with an existing scene, and then we'll adjust another existing scene and then build something from scratch. My name is Richard Fennell, and I am the Global Training Specialist at Luxion, makers of KeyShot. And first of all, I wanted to talk a little bit about translucent materials and what they actually are. First, I'm just going to show you an example of a translucent material that has subsurface scattering. So this picture is from Wikipedia. But when we talk about translucent materials, we talk about materials that have subsurface scattering as part of their properties. So unlike a completely opaque material, your fingers, if you hold it up to a light or to the sun, you're going to see some light that actually goes through the material. So that's what subsurface scattering is. So as light goes into the material, we see it with skin. We also see it with something like wax, right? So the light, as it goes underneath the surface of the material, it gets diffused and refracted and goes out in all kinds of different directions, right? So these are some examples of subsurface scattering in real-life materials. Okay, so how does that relate to how we work in KeyShot? Well, here's an example. So this is a rendering by Tim Fair. And I mentioned this one because here, for example, you can see that we have these buttons and this control right here. And we know from experience that those buttons are usually backlit. But when the light's not on, we still want to get that effect of them not being a totally opaque plastic. So using something, in this case, this was a wax material, using the translucent material will get us that type of effect. We also get the request pretty often. This is an example from Dries Veervoort, who's one of our users on the forum. And in this case, we have a translucent material applied to these cubes, and then we have lights on the inside. So people ask, how do I make glowing buttons or LEDs or things like that? So we'll talk about how the translucent material is affected by light and how we use it in our scene to get these types of effects. Also, and I think you guys have noticed that down at the bottom, or excuse me, on the side, you can type in questions. So as we go through it, and if you have questions, feel free to type those in, and we'll be responding. If it's something specific to you, then we'll try to address it on a one-on-one basis. If not, if there's anything important that gets pulled up, then I'll try to address it to everybody. But let's go ahead and hop into the first scene. The first scene is actually one of the sample scenes that we provide on our website, and I will go to a web browser, and looks like I close that window, so let me bring it back up, but I'll show you where you can get access to it. So if I type in keyshot.com into my web browser, and under resources, there's an area for downloads. And under the downloads, there's an option for scenes. So I just want to share this. So the first scene that I'm going to be working with is a scene that you can download. So this model was created by Alfredo Gilazzi. Sorry if I'm butchering your name if you're listening, right? But Rex Roberts went ahead and applied a lot of the materials in this scene and prepped it. So this is one you can download. You don't have to do it now. I just want to use this as kind of an intro, but you can always grab this and have it as reference. So I've already opened that scene here in KeyShot, right? So I paused KeyShot, so I unpaused it using Shift-P. But we already have all the materials applied here in this scene. But one material in particular, if I select that material, you'll see it highlighted in orange. Let's go ahead and zoom in on that. Has a translucent material applied to it. So I'll double click on that material to modify it. So this material already has a translucent material applied, right? And you can see under your material library, you have a folder full of these kind of starters for translucent material. But let's take a look at the material properties and the changes we can make to those. As you can see, we have a lot of different options and toggles here. So I just want to introduce the settings on this material that are giving us the effect of that kind of subsurface scattering. So the two that are going to make a really big difference here is going to be the colors, right? So on a translucent material, we have a surface color and we have a subsurface color, right? So the subsurface color is, as it says, right, that's the color that you get beneath the surface of the material, right? So I have a dark material on the outside, right, and I have a lighter subsurface color. So that means the light's going to reflect off the surface with a dark color, but as the light goes through the material, we start to see a lighter color, right? The translucency slider is also one that is probably the least understood. So the translucency slider controls how far deep into the surface we see that translucency. So I'll type in a small value, something like 0.5, and then we'll take a second to see the effect here. And as that reses up, we'll see there is some translucency to it, but the more you increase this slider, the more translucent that material is going to become. This was at a value of 3. Also, one thing to keep in mind, and this is really important specifically for this material, is that this slider is a smart slider, which means that if you max it out, in this case I've dragged it all the way to the right, which in this case is 6, you can always type in a larger or smaller value, right? So I can type in something like 25, right? So you can push this slider a lot farther, and that's really important. We'll see it in later scenes as well. But what most people don't know is this slider actually goes all the way to 1,000. So the translucency is going to be dependent on a few things. One is going to be the geometry itself. So the shape of the geometry, how thick those walls are, it's going to depend on your lighting, right? And we have this slider which goes from 1 all the way to 1,000, right? So you have a lot of control over your translucency. The next slider that I want to talk about is going to be the specularity slider. So specularity that's the reflectivity of a material surface. And to show this a little bit better, I'm going to turn down our roughness so that I'm working with a completely glossy surface, right? So now if I look at this material, and I'll bring that translucency down to a low value to try to bring out some of these reflections a little bit more. But if we look at this, we're going to get some glossy highlights because our specularity, and you can see that highlight right here, that reflection, right? Let me change out our lighting environment to something that has a little bit more contrast. And here we go. Now you can see I have an environment, light reflected here, and you can see that it's very reflective because of the specularity, right? So that's another thing to consider. So this is how reflective the surface is, right? And unlike a lot of our materials where the specularity is defined with a color, in this case I can define it with a value, right? So a value of 1 means that that's a very reflective surface. But in this case, this is going to be kind of a rubber material, so I don't want it to be that reflective. Well, what I can do is I could decrease the specularity, so I'm going to adjust that value. A smaller value means that there's less light reflected off that surface. So if I drop that down to a low value, something like 0.2, this means that my roughness is still set to 0, right? So this is still a very smooth, perfect, non-matte surface, but I've decreased the reflectivity by adjusting the specularity, right? So if I bring that back to 1, that'll give us a very reflective, translucent material. This is also one of the few materials that I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing it, but you can create a super specular surface, right? So if I type in a value of 2, because this is a smart slider, then it'll be extra glossy. I'm not sure there are a lot of real world scenarios for this, but it's good to know that you can create a super duper glossy translucent material by increasing that specularity, and that's something that you can't do with a lot of materials. You usually can't push it past 1 or a pure white, so a totally reflective surface, right? So I'll bring that back down to where it was at 1. And then the last slider I want to talk about here is going to be the roughness slider. So roughness, I'm going to right click and I'm going to look at, I'm going to zoom in here on the surface. The roughness is not a slider that adds texture, and that's a very important distinction to make. Whenever we add roughness, we're randomizing the reflections of the surface, right? So if you're trying to get some sort of super fine texture like a bead blasted finish or some sort of anodized micro texture, in that case we would do that by adding textures to the material. But the roughness randomizes the reflections. So in effect what it's doing is making more of a matte finish. So the more I increase that roughness, the more random my surface reflections are going to get, which gives me more of a matte finish. So I'll type in a small value here, right? So instead of those highlights being super sharp, they're going to be diffused over the surface. So again, this has nothing to do with texture, it just changes the randomness of those reflections, right? So by increasing the roughness, right, it in effect gives me more of a matte finish, right? So I'll back out and we'll let this res up for a second so we can see that translucent effect. Something to keep in mind too is that when you work with translucent materials, it does add on to the render time. So that's something to consider, right? So make sure that you're using as many cores as you have available to you, right? Or just know that you're going to be increasing render times. For the sake of this demo, I'm using a pretty powerful workstation. It has 48 cores in it. I've bumped that down to 46 just for the demo, right? But that's an introduction to the translucent material. So let's take a second to actually go through some workflows and then see how we can use it. I'm going to go ahead and open another model that I've already prepared. And here is Kevin. Oh, and just as a reminder, this model, the Reebok model you see here, is available on our website, right? So you can download this whole KeyShot package, and it has all the materials and textures ready to go. Okay, so let's go ahead and open this. Okay, so here is Kevin. So this is a ZBrush model, and so it came in, and it kept the Polypaint on it, right? So if I bring up my heads-up display, I can get to that by hitting H on my keyboard. You can see that I've got a pretty hefty scene. It's got about 6 million triangles, which means it's got a lot of really, really nicely modeled detail, right? So I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to look at this model. Right, and if I click on that material, it just has right now it just has the diffuse or the default material applied to the part. So we're not getting anything in the effect of translucency or subsurface scattering. The color is coming from the Polypaint, so this image texture on top, right, which is pushed over from ZBrush, and then it's wrapped to this model. Okay. So I'm just going to adjust this in the scene. Okay, so how do we start working with the advanced or the translucent materials to get our effect? If you're pushing your models over from ZBrush and they don't come over with the translucent material already applied, what you can do is you can go over to your material library. We can go to the translucent folder, right? And let me make these previews a little bit bigger, right? And we have some pre-made translucent materials, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with one of these skin materials, right? And I'm going to drag that over onto my model. You can see if I don't let go, that actually looks pretty gross. But if I don't let go, up at the top you can see hold Alt to retain textures and or Control to retain labels. Since we already have our Polypaint applied, that's come in as an image texture on that diffuse material. But if I hold down Alt, that means that it's going to keep that texture and change the material type. So if I right-click that and I edit that material, you can see it's changed that to the translucent material, and we've retained our color texture. Right. So now when I move my my mouse around and we zoom in on this material, you'll see that we'll start to see that effect of the translucency or that subsurface scattering. Right. I'll turn off the color texture. So this is just what human skin looks like in this scene, and that looks pretty gross. Looks like a naked mole rat, you know. But I'll go ahead and throw that color texture back on, right? And so now we can see what that model looks like with the texture applied. And by the way, I just want to quickly mention down here, you can see it. This model is courtesy of Dreamsmith. Their website is dreamsmith.biz, right? So they prepared this model and shared it with us. So I just want to give credit where credit is due on this one. Right, so we started with the kind of human skin material. We have our Polypaint on top, and now we can go in and we can start customizing this, right? And just like we did before, we have our surface color and then we have our subsurface color. In this case, that actually looks okay, right? So we have kind of a skin-ish color, right? But we can adjust it a little bit more to match our Polypaint a little better. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change that color. But since I have a texture applied here, I can just use my eyedropper tool. And I got to that eyedropper tool just by hitting this little icon at the top left of my color window. I can select that, and I can just find a color on the surface, right? And that's going to give me more of a red surface color. And what I'm going to do to give our skin a little bit of a glow is I'm going to change the subsurface color to be a lighter color. And that's usually a recommendation that I can make. You usually want to work with a subsurface color that's a little bit lighter than your surface color. Right? So you can see here we have our translucency set to 5. I'll decrease that to 1. If we look at our model now, you can see I've got some shadows on it, but they're kind of stopping after a certain point. Whereas if I increase that specularity, oops, sorry, not specularity, translucency, right, we're going to get that light that goes farther through our surface, right? So the light's going to go farther into the material before it gets reflected back out. So now we're getting that nice translucency on this part, right? Specularity, I don't necessarily want him to be super shiny, right? So I could decrease that a little bit, right? And I can increase the roughness to help break that reflection over the material, right? Now if I take a look at this, that's got that kind of translucency in it, right? And I will actually decrease the lightness on that surface, or just actually cut down on the saturation a little bit more so we see more of that poly paint that's coming through, right? Okay, I'm going to tab over really quick and see if there are any questions that need to be addressed. All right, so far, nothing. Okay, so I'll keep on going. All right, the rest of this, so in this model, right, we have a bunch of other materials, and what we could do is continue applying this, right? So same thing here. These teeth already have that poly paint retained for them, so we can do the same thing. We can start with the translucent. Instead of working with the human skin, which has those kind of flesh tones to it, I'll work with just one of these translucents. I'll just get this translucent medium, apply it to the teeth, and again, since we want to retain that poly paint, I'm going to hold down Alt, right? And then now we have our translucent material. And here, those teeth are going to be a really good example of that translucency in the material, right? And this is a good example of zero roughness, right? So it looks like these teeth are nice and shiny, right? They've got that nice sheen on them, and we do have some translucency. And if I back that down, you'll see that there's now a little bit less translucency in that material, right? So that translucency slider is going to be really important for getting the correct appearance that you want, right? So in this case, it's just fully painting out this scene, right? So our ground here, which is a liquid material, I'll just change that to liquid, right? And then I'll double click on this. These were just some rocks. I don't know if I have any stone materials built in, right? But I would just change that to, let's say, a dark kind of paint material. And then now we have these rocks sitting in liquid. And you can see more examples of the models made by the Dreamsmith team on their website. But yeah, so that's how we can start with a model that already has the poly paint applied to it. And then from there, adjust the materials to get our realistic kind of skin materials. All right, so let me go ahead and close this scene down, and then we'll start from actually importing a model and then talking about bringing those models in and adjusting them to get the correct effects with our translucent materials. Okay, so first I'm going to get, this is a NX model or a Unigraphics model. So I'm just going to bring this one in, and I'm going to import it here into my KeyShot scene. One important thing that I'm going to change here from the default is to set the size to keep original. This was modeled with real units, in this case millimeters, so I just want to make sure that this respects the original units upon import, right? So if I hit keep original, then it'll retain whatever the modeling units were. I'm also going to check accurate tessellation. That should be on by default, but I'll go ahead and import this model into the scene. Okay, all right, I'm going to hit F to go into full screen mode, and let's take a look at our model here. So it's a 12-sided shape, right? And the idea behind this is to turn this into some sort of lamp, Right, so I'm going to change out my environment to something that has a little bit more contrast in it. So I already have some favorites set up here. Right, so this environment has some contrast, so I can start to see the changes that happen with this material. For the kind of the shell, what I'll do is I'm going to change this to just a, let's say, a paint. So we'll start with a glossy black paint and apply it to that part. Right. Okay, so now let's take a look at how we can make this translucent. Right. Again, I can either, two ways to start with translucency. If I double click on that material, I can edit it, and I can use this drop down to change it to the translucent material, or I can start with the pre-made translucent material, just drag it onto my part. I'll do that. I'll just get that translucent medium and drag it over and apply it. Right, so you can see here we're starting to see that it's rendering up, right? But we have this surface color, which is gray, and then we have a lighter subsurface color. So we'll see a little bit of kind of glowing in that material. And I'll right-click on this part and look at, so we can start to see this material a little bit better. Right. I'm also going to adjust the translucency, right? So I can decrease that or increase that, right? But what I want to do, if I actually have a lamp on this, and I'm going to increase the roughness on the surface a little bit so it breaks up those reflections, right? But if I wanted to make some sort of lamp, so something like in our example that we had earlier, right? So something like this scene right here, we need to introduce a light, right? And what we need to do here is we're going to introduce a physical light to the scene. If we want to actually have something illuminated, we need to have something in our scene that we can apply the light material to. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add a piece of geometry to the scene that has the light material. And what I'll do is I'll go to Edit, and then I can add a piece of geometry, and then I can add some simple pieces of geometry. In this case, I'm going to get a sphere. Right, so now that I've added that piece of geometry, right, add geometry and sphere, you can see that I have a sphere in my scene, and it's this little tiny dot down here at the bottom. I'm going to use the Move tool to reposition it, and I'm just going to place it above my scene, or above my model. So now you can see I have this teeny tiny circle, and I'm going to scale that up so we can see it a little bit better. Right, so now I have the sphere that's floating above my part. Right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to change that to a light emitting material. So we have a couple basic light types in KeyShot. But in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use a drop down here, and I'm going to change the material type. And down here we have light materials. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to a point light diffuse. Right. So now I have this light in my scene. Right. If you see this orange dot here, that means that's the representation of the light. Wherever our sphere was, right in the middle of that piece of geometry, we now have a light, right? You can toggle that little dot on and off by hitting L, right? So that shows me the active lights in my scene. Okay, so now we have this light in the scene. Two things that are going to affect how much light we see here is, one is going to be the environment brightness. I'm going to turn that down because if we have a really bright environment, we're not going to see the light as much. But the other thing that you should enable is under the settings, we can turn on global illumination and ground illumination, right? And now we see that this light is illuminating, right, both our part here, so that's our global illumination, and then our ground illumination, right? So that enables illumination on our ground plane. Right. In this case, it's a really bright light, right? And if I right-click that part and edit it, or select it here in the scene tree and hit Edit Material, you can see that I can adjust the color of that light, right? But something that I'm noticing is that this light is super bright, and it's blowing out our scene, right? Some of you may have seen this before. What I can try to do is I can adjust the power of that light, right? So I can drop that down from 100 watts to 10 watts, but it's still blowing out my front surface here. Now I'm down at 1 watt, right? So that's a much lower power. The other thing that we can do, and this is going to be really important when in regards to lighting, is I can change the units here in my scene, right? So if I click on my model, right, it knows that this was modeled in millimeters, right? So that means that we have a tiny little dot that's emitting 100 watts, and it's probably about 30 millimeters from our part, which is why it's so bright. So what we can do is we can change the in-scene units. what that will do is that will increase the distance. It won't scale our model, right? But it tells the light, by definition, you're traveling a lot farther. So it's not going to be as blown out, right? So we can adjust that. This is what I would do. This would be one of my starting points if in your scene you add lights and they're totally blown out, or if you turn up the brightness and you just can't see anything. The way we can do that, I can go to Edit, and I can set my scene units. And this will determine the units that are used in our scene. And what I'm going to do is let's try changing those to something bigger, like inches. So I'll select inches, right? And now I can correlate the scene units. And what that does is you can see 1 millimeter becomes 1 inch. And this distance between our light and the surface is going to become a lot greater. So now when I hit OK, right? So now that light is a lot more subtle. Right? So now I can go back. I can select that material and I can edit it, right? And now I can adjust the power without it blowing out the whole scene. Right? So now I have that light above my part and it's glowing. Well, what if I want that on the inside? Let's say this is some sort of table lamp, right? Well, then I can get this sphere, go to my position tab, use the move tool, and then I can place the sphere on the inside of my geometry, and now it's going to start to glow from the inside, right? And what I'll do here is double click on our translucent material, right? So our translucency slider here, this determines how much light is coming through, right? So let's try increasing that. So I can bump that up to something like 25, and I start to see a little bit more, still not great. So instead of making the light brighter, we can also adjust it on the material, right? So now you can see that I'm getting a little bit more translucency. And like I mentioned before, this slider goes all the way to 1,000. So you can try pushing some bigger numbers, right? So now you can see I'm getting that nice glowing effect. And the light is also glowing, or the light is actually illuminating onto my ground plane now, right? So if I bump this up even more, right, now you can see that it's casting light onto the ground plane, right? So that's going to be really important to get those types of lamps or glowing buttons, right? It's going to be two components. One is going to be the translucent material, but then also some sort of light, right? And that light is applied as a material to a piece of geometry, right? So if I select one of these parts here, right, and I turn it off, right, you can see that that light is glowing up the inside of my dodecahedron, right, and I'll turn that brightness way down, right, so now most of the lighting is coming from that little point light on the inside, right, and it's doing a pretty good job illuminating. When you start working with translucent materials and you want to change the color of those materials, right, so these are all like a gray material. Well, what I'll do is I'll select this part right here, and if I hit unlink materials, now I can make material changes to this part alone, right? And what I'll do is I'll go over to my colors tab, right? And let's get one of these energetic lights, or excuse me, energetic colors. And I can grab a color and I can drag it directly onto a material. Oh, didn't catch for some reason. If I double click on it, I can just drag the color over here to the color well, right? And so now I have a blue translucent material, right? And it's still white as my subsurface color, right? But now I can change, even though I have one light, right? I'm going to unlink this material here, and let's go ahead and let's make kind of a multicolored lamp, right? So now we've got different colors of materials on all these separate components. Right. Okay. Cool. So even though we only have one light source, right, we have these different colors shining through. And what I'll do, let's put these on the ground as well, or on these parts so that the light shines onto the ground. I can select this material and I can copy it, so I can hit right click and copy the material. The other thing I can do is I can hold down shift and hit left click, right, or shift, and that basically that's the equivalent of copy. And then if I hit shift and right click, that's the equivalent of paste. Right, so shift left click copy, shift right click paste. Right, so now you can see I've got multicolored light coming from a single light source because it's going through my translucent material. Right, and we'll let this sit and res up for just a second. Right, and again we can control the amount of translucency using our sliders here, right, and that's going to control the amount of light that's going to go through that material. right? And then again, we talked about the specularity, we talked about the roughness, right? But important as well is going to be that global illumination and ground illumination when you're using a light material to get this effect. Okay. Josh and Sean, how are we doing on questions?
Not too many. Ethan wants to know what happens if he updates his model after changing the units.
It shouldn't make any changes to the model itself. Tell you what, let's go ahead and try that. There's no better way to find out exactly what happens. So let's go to our 3D models and let's get that same model and we'll re-import it into the scene, right? And what we'll do is we'll use the update geometry function, which will retain the materials and textures we've applied, right? So we'll just update that geometry and let's see what happens. But it shouldn't change the scale. However, since someone's asking me a question and I'm being recorded, of course it's going to go wrong. Oh no, it worked out okay. Worked out okay. Since we made those unlinks to our material after we brought it in, right? It relinked all those up. What I could do in my CAD application would be to change the color of those parts. But it looks like, yep, it retained whatever units we had that we had determined after we had imported it. Any other questions?
Yes, Bill Gould is wondering about the dots that sometimes show up when you're using the physical lights and how to remove those.
Yes, and let me see if I can recreate that. Yeah, let's try. I'm going to try to create the dots. I'm going to go back to millimeters and change our inches to millimeters, and you'll see that's blowing out, right? So we've got an instance here where we have a bunch of dots, right? And this is just giant blue because it's a ton of dots. So those dots are coming from areas of high intensity. So if you're running into some sort of issue where you start to see some dots in your scene, it has to do with that intensity. And it could be two things. One, it could be the incorrect scale for your model. The other, it could be that your lights are too powerful, right? In this case, what I can do is what we just did is I can back that down and change the scale on it, right? So now we have our 1 inch instead of millimeters, and these dots aren't going to be those super bright dots that we were looking at before. But sometimes you also get dots if you push the power too far, right? And I'll see if I can recreate that. Let's try 1,000 watts. Right? No, that's not giving me the dot. Let's try 5,000 watts. Cool, so same effect, right? So it's going to have to do with the scale in your scene and the wattage that you're using for the lights, right? So now I'm starting to get some dots. And sometimes you'll see it on the parts themselves. In this case, I'm not seeing it. They're resolving nicely. You can just barely see that here we're getting some dots. But if you do get the dots, try adjusting your scene units. That's like the first step that I would take to try to resolve those dots. And then after that, take a look at the individual power of all of your lights so that it's not blowing that out. Additionally, after that, it may be due to the materials that are used in your scene. If you have materials that have high roughness values, sometimes reducing that roughness or reducing the bump height will help get rid of those white dots. And if you in the future have any examples of something that you're trying to resolve and can't get it figured out, take a look at our forum and try posting it on our forum, and I can keep an eye out for any of those in regards to our webinar today.
All right. Thanks, Richard. Fabio is wondering about the surface that you applied the translucent material to. He's wondering if it has a thickness, and if it does, how that affects materials.
Right. That's a really good question. Okay, so this part does have thickness, right? So if I right-click this part and hit Show Only, and I'm realizing that I'm also turning off my light, so the screen's going to go dark. Okay, so let's also decrease that power back down to something a little more reasonable. Right. Yes, so that's a great question. So this part, if I zoom in here, you can see does have thickness, right? And that will make an effect, and you'll get better results when you do have some material thickness, because then it actually has some geometry upon which to cast shadows, right? So if I take a look at my edge here, right, you can see that that material is kind of fading away. I'm looking directly at the edge, because on this front surface, that's where I'm getting the full direct light, right? And the farther away I get from that, I start to see the shadow of that surface through the rest of the material. So if possible, try having some sort of surface thickness, because it will give you a more accurate representation of that material. Anything else, Josh or Sean?
Yeah, we have quite a few all of a sudden here, going through them. Melanie is wondering how you can modify the watts so the light doesn't blow up on the material, but you're able to get a shadow cast, like if you have holes in your surfaces. And the example she gives is artistic lights. So I believe
Not
that would be
entirely.
like light shining through a perforated material.
Okay. Well, if it is a perforated material here, let's hit Show All Parts, and let's hide everything but this, the kind of frame part. And I'll turn my lighting sphere back on. Right. So if we've got holes in our material and you use light material, then those shadows are going to be represented, right? So this is still solid geometry. I haven't applied translucency to it, right? But our shadows are being cast from the physical light that we've placed. So let's try turning this material into a translucent material, and let's see what happens. And what I'll do here is I'm going to double click on this material, or this part, which brings up the material editor, and I'll change that to the translucent material, right? And since we have our bright light right next to it, let's go ahead. One thing, I wouldn't recommend using pure black for our surface color, right? Use a very, very dark gray, but don't use a pure black. And the subsurface color, again, we want to use a lighter color as our subsurface color. All right, so we're not seeing much translucency here, so let's try bumping this up to a bigger value. Well, still not too much. Okay, let's reset this back. Okay, so now let's take a look at our material. All right, increase that translucency. Right. So now, if you guys can see, along that edge, we're starting to get some more translucency, and you can really see it on here on the inside, right? I'll also turn on a little bit of rough, or increase the roughness so that it doesn't give us that super shiny surface. It's more of a matte finish, right? But we'll start to see, even with a hole, you can see the edges, right? So we can see that kind of light fading away from the edges. Hope that answers the question.
That looks great, Richard. Brett had a really good question. When do you decide to use translucency materials versus plastic, and just adjusting the diffuse and specular transmission to achieve translucency or transparency?
Right, that's a good question. Both are going to, good way of putting it, but both are going to adversely affect your render times, right? But let's try comparing that, right? So I'm going to change this back to metal. I'm going to right-click, and show all parts. And let's do kind of a side-by-side comparison, right? So this part right here still has the translucent material applied. All of these do, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this part right here, and I'm going to unlink it, right? And then let's change this material type, right? So something like our plastic material. And the question was about under our plastic material, under advanced, you can control the transmission colors. So that's the color of light that goes through the material. Since we just changed this to a regular plastic, not a clear plastic, those are black, which means no light is going through, right? If I change the specular transmission value, that means that now I can start to get light going through this material, right? And there are those white spots because our light is up at a really high brightness, right? But what the plastic materials don't do is it doesn't change the direction of the light going through the material. The light is still going straight out from our single light source. So we won't get any of that that subsurface scattering, that light bouncing under the surface of the material, and that's one of the big differences. Right. So you won't get that with just the plastic material. You won't get the smoky or the hazy kind of effect. In order to get that kind of smoky or hazy effect, you'd have to use either the advanced material or the dielectric material, which has the roughness transmission slider. That would give you more of a frosted plastic, but it's not going to have those nice gradients on the inside of the material based off of the subsurface scattering.
That's great. We have some questions on liquids and working with liquid materials and translucent materials, whether to use translucent materials as for the liquids and the container, and what happens when you use both, and when to use one or the other for a liquid.
The only time I would use a translucent material for a liquid is if it's, I guess, what's our scientific definition for those? It's like a colloid. A colloid is a material that has particles suspended in it, that's like milk or orange juice, right? So it's unlike, let's say, water, right, which is the same all throughout the material. If I was doing something like, if I was trying to render orange juice or milk, those are two really specific examples that I would use a translucent material for a liquid. But otherwise, I would just use the liquid material. Let me see if I have that scene available. But under your scenes folder, if I could find it. I don't know where my scenes folder is. In your scenes folder, normally you have a scene that's meant to show rendering liquids, and it's a cognac glass with some liquids, and that's all done through surfaces, right? But if that answers your question of when I would use materials that are translucent for liquids, it's only something that has that kind of effect to it, like milk or orange juice. Technically, those are colloids. Sorry to hit you with the scientific term.
We have a question on importing human models or models with human skin. This could be a creature model too, but sometimes they import with different or separate geometries,
right?
Different textures applied, and when the translucent material is used, the edges, the junctions where those parts meet, get a really rough edge or discolored edge. And
all right.
What is the solution for that?
I don't know a solution for that off the top of my head. I know there are a couple discussion threads on it, since that's come up with previous customers and it's on our forum. I would suggest that they take a look at the forum, or shoot an email over to support@luxion.com that they may be able to get back to them. But I don't know the exact fix for that off the top of my head. I don't have as much experience working with that kind of geometry.
What are the best render settings for translucent materials in rendering? Michael Hicks would like to know.
Oh, okay, that's a really good question, right? If I double-click on my translucent material, one thing that you'll notice, and it's down here under Advanced, but the translucent materials, in order to get better results, require more samples for that material. Right? So what a sample is that for every pixel we have on screen, we've got a photon that bounces somewhere in our environment or from a light material. It hits a surface, and then that light gets bounced back to that pixel. Right? So that's a single sample. This is how we determine what color should be what. Right? So that's how we actually create that image. The more samples you have, the more realistic, or excuse me, the more accurate that material becomes. Right? So a higher sample value means that you're going to get better representation of a material. If you've ever worked with a translucent material or sometimes cloudy plastics or different materials that look like they stay a little bit grainy and you're not entirely sure why, a lot of that has to do with the samples value. And for the translucent material, if I hit the drop down under advanced, you can see there's a slider for samples. And by default, that's at 25, which is actually one of the highest settings of any of the default materials. So generally, you should get better results with the default translucent material because it has higher sample values, right? If you're still getting some graininess in your samples, you can try increasing that, right? So I'd try increasing that maybe to 32. 32 is usually like good enough for me. It's rare that I go over 32 samples on almost anything, right? So in order to get better translucent materials, right, try increasing your sample value. And when you're actually rendering this out, let's say we weren't relying on just the screen image here, and I go to my quality settings, right? If I'm using max time or max samples, right, increase that value. So something like max time, if you're still getting grainy results after 5 minutes, then try changing that to 8 minutes or 10 minutes. But because translucent materials are more complex, they need more time to resolve, or they need more samples. And under advanced control, you can see here that there's a slider for samples. This slider is for your overall scene. So if you change the samples on a specific material, it only changes those for that one material, which means that our whole scene is going to render with 16 samples, except the translucent materials, which in this case are going to render with 32 samples. So that means that it's going to take a little bit longer, right? But we're going to get better fidelity off of that material because of a higher sample value.
All right. Thanks, Richard. Kevin would like an explanation of the refraction index under the advanced setting.
Okay, so the refraction index, and in this case, I'd actually refer to our handy-dandy manual, right? If under the help menu, we have a manual, right? So there's actually a pretty good manual built in, and I say it's really good. Part of that is we have pictures and lots of pictures. Right, so what I'm going to do is go over to our material settings, and I want to find out more about our refraction index, right? So here's a picture with our refraction index. So whenever light hits a material and bounces off or goes through it, it basically changes speed, and that distorts that light, right? So we've seen that before, and here's this image here where our pencil looking through this glass and water, right? It looks like it's distorted, right? It's broken. That's because different materials have a different refraction index. And in the description, you can see here, water has a refraction index of 1.33, right? Diamonds 2.4, glass 1.5, honey is one number, cognac is another, right? All these different materials have a different refraction index, which means that if you're trying to recreate a material in KeyShot, right, my recommendation, if you're trying to create a very particular material, like some sort of polycarbonate material or some specific paint or plastic, if you do a web search for refraction index and whatever material you want, like diamonds or honey, right, usually you can find a number, because this number is a real-life number. It's based off of the optical characteristics of a material, and that's hard science. That doesn't change, right? So that's what the refraction index does, right? But it changes the way the light either bounces off a material or the light going through the material, the angle that it changes when it hits that surface. So that's what a refraction index is.
And another question on when would you use that global illumination checkbox under the advanced properties?
I generally don't adjust it on the material settings because what I will do is I'll just enable it globally, right? So if we check it here, that'll enable the global illumination on a per material basis. However, I want to see it everywhere, so I just check it under global illumination right there under our settings so that it's on everywhere, especially when working with physical lights.
I think that's about all we have time for.
Okay.
All right, everyone. Cool. Thanks for joining us. We will be posting this this webinar on YouTube, and it'll be up on our site also in the webinar section. If you have more questions, head over to the forum and ask them. And in the meantime, have a good week, and we will see you next time.